Thanks everyone for attending the fifth in the series of our new series called Critical Conversations. And I think all of you know by now, Critical Conversations was started as a way to bring in outside speakers to Gladstone to talk about important subjects that could spark critical conversations within our community. I'm very excited to announce our next speaker, award-winning designer, Stephen Gates, who has designed for some of the top brands in the world, including many Fortune 100 brands. For those of you on the webinar, especially in the scientific crowd, if you ever remember going to a scientific conference, maybe signing up because of that one speaker, or certainly rearranging your entire day to attend that session, that's who Stephen Gates is for me. And I was very shocked and surprised when he responded to my email to participate in this series, but I couldn't be more thrilled. Steve and I go way back, like all the way to 2019. And by that, I mean, I was the one sitting in the front row, like a little girl, hanging on Stephen's every word. And I have ever since that moment. Stephen has an award-winning podcast called The Crazy One. And he speaks on a wide variety of topics, including insights on how to be more creative, how to become a better leader, how to create more innovative work, build better relationships, grow a strong career, and there is so much more. I really encourage all of you, while we're all at home and looking for something to do and something different to listen to tune into Stephen's podcast, The Crazy One. But some of you on the line also might be thinking, how is it that a leader in the creative field or design field can help me? And that's everyone from scientists to administrators. And the only thing that I ask is that you open your minds, focus on his words. And in the best world, I think we all truly believe that we all have something to learn from one another. And that's the case with Stephen for sure. Being creative is something that we all do in our work. It's maybe not what people call it, but it's true. For scientists, you're constantly trying to tell your story, whether it's through a grant application, through a scientific paper, through a scientific presentation. Creativity goes into every design experiment, goes into every administrative project that we produce. So we're all creatives in a sense. And that's why I'm so pleased to have Stephen share some new insights with us to get us thinking a little bit differently today. Stephen, thank you again so much for your time. And please feel free to take the floor.
Well, thanks so much. Yeah, it's always, I mean, look, I've met me, I'm not that cool. I think, like, you know, thank you for Megan for the fangirl moment. It's always flattering and it feels like you're talking about somebody else or something. But yes, I think, you know, the plan for today is going to be, I've got probably about 35, 40 minutes worth of talking to be able to do. And then after that, we'll sort of do a Q&A, and we can do that where if somebody wants to come off mute and just have a conversation, we can do that. Put it in the chat, sort of whatever it is you feel comfortable with. Again, I know a lot of is going on in a lot of people's lives and things like that. So feel free to contribute and share any way that you want. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So hopefully everybody can see that. So yeah, look, there is nobody who is trying to figure out why do I end up talking to groups like this than me, because it has definitely been an interesting journey to be able to get here. So yeah, my name is Steve Gates. I have the dangerously Silicon Valley-esque title of head design evangelist at InVision. We'll get into what that means in a minute. This is sort of my ongoing effort to kill boring conference photos. I think it tends to scare the crap out of people more than anything, but that's fine. So for me as a designer, this is literally where it started. I think it certainly never hurts to show yourself as a child when you try to get to know a new group of people. But so my design education started literally at 2 years old. My father was a creative director in Pittsburgh. This is me standing on the feed tray of the 700-pound cast iron letterpress that continues to sit in my parents' basement. We would actually write my own storybooks. So we would go down and do it. I would then letter set the type. My dad would do linoleum cut. It's a lot of, like, while it was fun, I'm sure they would call Child Protective Services today because it was like a kid handling lead and heavy machinery. It basically meant I was a hipster by the time I was in kindergarten because I had been like self-publishing for years. It's just like, I didn't know Brooklyn existed then, but it was just like every joke you ever have about a designer starts there. I've done a lot of very interesting stuff over the course of my career, everything from helping American Airlines rebuild their brand and stay in business after September 11th, I was one of the first 6, I think, outsiders that was called by Johnny Ive to work on the Apple Watch months before it was released. If you ever want to work on something incredibly exciting and completely terrifying, work on unreleased Apple hardware. But it's been an interesting journey for me. So like I worked in agencies. I spent 9 years building the global brand design and innovation team at Starwood. I spent 3 years as the first global head of design in the 210-year history of Citibank, and then landed here. And really all that crazy sounding title means is that I take sort of the practical experience I've had working with all sorts of different companies to try to help them rediscover and sort of elevate creativity, because I think that there's a big demand for it. A lot of companies aren't sure how to do it, and I'm able to come in to be able to work with them. Now that has taken me to places I never would imagine in doing things like working with the engineering team at Scuderia Lamborghini. So actually going in and working with high performance engineers to be able to help them be more creative and work together. Other ones, like, so I'm actually working with the team at NASA, the astronauts and scientists that are responsible for sending people to Mars. Whenever I got this call, I was convinced that they had looked up the wrong gates in the phone book, because I'm like, look, there's this guy named Bill who's in Seattle. I think this is more of his thing. Like, maybe go call him. But they wanted to talk about creativity and how to be more innovative and what to do. So crazy things, but these are some of the companies that I work with. And so big companies, small companies, creative companies, engineering companies, like all sorts of different ones, to be able to help them do these different things. So what I want to be able to do is, again, this is just, the start of a first talk coming in to be able to do this, is share some of what are those barriers that I've seen that come up a lot. And I think, to what Megan had said, I didn't think the world needed another podcast. For the last 4 years, I've had the crazy one that talks about all this stuff. And thanks to the pandemic and a little bit too much free time, it's now a YouTube channel too. So I don't know what, I'm apparently allergic to free time or something, but I think that's what I just want to talk about, is sort of like creativity, innovation, because, one of the interesting things I think I'm often able to bring is perspective and context. So we work with 100% of the world's Fortune 100 brands, which lets us see a lot of what works and what doesn't. And so for me, knowing that, look, my background as a designer, that's most of the companies that I work with, but it really has morphed into sort of just working with people who create anything. It could be in this case where it's more science and research, other people where it's more cars, other people where it's like rockets or different things like that. But there's just sort of a shared, I don't know what, there's something in the human condition that for me over this last 2.5-year journey has become really fascinating, because I work with companies on 5 continents that right now I think speak about 16 different languages, and you still see certain things that remain true. And I guess I just want to sort of start by, just calling out some of the things that I think many of us are going through and experiencing. I think that one is that this digital, whatever this is, of sort of going from being in person and being all together to now having that context of being at work shattered and being on our own, has created a lot of challenges. I think, one of the biggest ones is that for a lot of companies, it's sort of exposed all their organizational sin. So if there were issues around leadership or trust or process or tooling or different things like that, these were problems that probably existed in the past. But in many ways, and you'll hear people talk about, like, apparently creativity didn't exist before hallways, because everybody will talk about, like, how can we be creative if we can't see each other in the hall? So I don't know. Apparently before hallways, nobody invented anything. I don't know. But I think a lot of what it is sort of realizing that what had been happening was we were leaning on that physicality for a lot of our work, and that this has sort of exposed some of those sort of things. I think that we're seeing in a lot of cases the way that we manage people, the way that we be able to actually lean in and work with people, that in a lot of cases, a lot of this wasn't working. And that's sort of like my door is always open, or doing these sort of things wasn't really working. And now whenever we're here, whenever the shared context of an office has been stripped away, whenever it comes down to how do we actually interact with each other, a lot of leaders are really struggling. And I think, that's a huge part of what I'm doing right now, is coaching CEOs who are trying to figure out how to keep their company together. But I think, there's also, like I talked about, it exposes these sort of things. One of the biggest things I get asked about is sort of like, well, how do we know if people are working, and how can we be creative if we can't see each other? To which I'll usually ask whoever that leader is, like, what sort of culture and company have you created where that's the first thing you're worried about? But, this is an unprecedented time. There's no way of being able to get around that. There needs to be things like different teams and people need to be empowered to make decisions. That's not anything new. If you look at all the companies that everybody always loves to point at, the Apples, the Amazons, the Nikes, the whatever it is, this is what they do. But again, it requires trust and doing some sort of difficult things to be able to get there. But that is, and this is one of the things we're going to talk about today, is I don't care what it is you are doing, no matter if it is teamwork in any form, it is creativity in any form, a lot of it does come down to trust and how do you interact and trust each other. And if that doesn't exist, it becomes something that is much more functional. It becomes something that is much more executional, and that's often where innovation goes to die. But I think that there's also a personal side to this that you can't overlook, because for many of us, there used to be this sort of very clear delineation of a block of time in the morning that was for us, some sort of a commute, you spent time in the office, some sort of a commute, you spent time at home. And yes, there's always bleed around that, but this is something totally different. This is where your boundaries between that just get put into a blender, often on a minute-by-minute basis, where, you know, again, you need to be a teacher, you need to be a chef, you need to be a counselor, you need to be an employee, all on a minute-by-minute basis. And, you know, the number of times that, again, we all see into each other's lives so much more differently. You get to see into people's homes, you get to see into who it is they actually are, you get to see that apparently I live in some sort of like Toys R Us store that exploded all over the inside of my room here. Like, there's some of these things that you just see that are so very different. But again, I think that these are all things that we're getting used to, and these all have effects on what's going on. But really, a lot of the work I do is sort of based in two things. And I think if you ever talk to any creative person or anybody like that, apparently we can solve all the problems of the universe with anywhere from 2 to 3 circles, because we can explain everything in the world in 2 to 3 circles. But in this case, you know, for me, a lot of the cases, whenever you look at 74% of companies that want to evolve fail because of these 2 circles. And that is that most companies, whenever they say, hey, look, we want to be better, we want to be different, we want to be able to evolve, what they often look at and invest in is behavior. And that is, what do people say? That is, what are the processes they use? What are the, you know, these sort of basic things that are often the expression of what is going on at a company. And that's why in many cases they'll come in, they get a new mission statement, they get some new values, they get these sort of things, which is great. But then in 3 to 4 months, the exact same problem, pops up just with different buzzwords and maybe in a different way. So for me, like, this is where most companies focus. When you focus on it, that's why this fails, because we're not dealing with the root of it, which is the real problem, which is the way people think. And that, you know, these are times when these can be difficult conversations. They can be ones where we're not sure where to start. We're part of a company, we don't know what to do. But there's a few things here that I just want to be able to sort of touch on today. And the point of all of my talks, especially for ones like this, I think, is to hopefully try to provide some insights, try to be able to provide a few frameworks or something like that I feel like have worked. But more than anything, it's to hopefully, after this, to get conversations and questions to be started. Because for me to be able to say and come in and say, look, I'm going to talk for 45 minutes to a bunch of people I have not worked with before and give you all the answers is just naive. And I think that for me, just under that recognition, it's, you know, the assumption that everybody here is smart enough and good enough and empowered enough to be able to do these sort of things. It's just, again, how do we start to have what might be some difficult conversations around this? So this is what we're going to focus on today, is just some of these issues around thinking. And one of the first ones is, and obviously if you get into a research field, I have started research practices inside of big companies and things like that, is that especially as it goes to creativity, cognitive bias becomes one of the biggest issues and one of the biggest stumbling blocks to doing creativity. Now, there's 2 forms of this a lot of people like to talk about. Imposter syndrome, which means I have an idea or I have an insight, I'm not sure that it's right, I'm not sure that it is going to hold any water, or people might make fun of me, so I'm not going to do anything with it. Cognitive bias is more, how does our brain influence the information that we take in to form our own narratives? And that obviously, as we get into research, creativity, things like this starts to have a real issue. But it's just, again, it is something that every person on the planet has, that there are just these systematic errors in thinking that affects our decision and judgment. Now, in pointing these out, and none of this is about judgment or saying that it's wrong, it's just about recognizing that these are factors that influence the work that gets done. Now, depending on who it is you talk to, there's somewhere between 12 and 16 different accepted versions of cognitive bias. I've only got 40 minutes, so we're just going to focus on 2. And I think that the 2 here are different ones that I think affect a lot of the teams that I work with. Now, confirmation bias, I think, is, and this is a very interesting one, I think, for the times that we live in. I think, obviously, as we look at what has been going on because of COVID because of what seems to be the ideological divide that seems to have been put around what seems to be fairly solid science and different things like that. As we look at what is going on with gender and racial issues, confirmation bias often is the root of a lot of these sort of things. And I would talk about this long before a lot of what's going on had happened, but it's just, again, we all have this unconscious act where we like to agree with perspectives that support our views. This is why every social media network has a mute button. This is why a lot of people have unfriended each other. It's basically that, you know, how do we have a conversation with other people? Because whenever confirmation bias kicks in, it really means that no matter how valid another opinion is, we don't agree with it. And it's because in many cases, our brain likes to gravitate towards having a solution. Whenever you are posed with a problem, whenever you study the science of creativity, whenever you actually have an idea, you get a little hit of dopamine, which is actually the exact same thing as whenever you unlock your phone or you get a like on Instagram or TikTok or something, that sort of reinforces that. So that's what it is we like to gravitate towards. But the problem is that as we look at teams, and whenever I'll do this in a lot of cases, you go in and you look at the makeup of a team. The thing is that whenever confirmation bias kicks in, if we want to have good ideas, if we want to do good research, we need a cognitive diversity. We need diversity in all of its forms. But, you know, I can't tell you the number of times that I've sat in a boardroom, that I've sat with a team and sort of said, look, the problem that often happens is that you start to hire people who think like you, who agree with you, who look like you, who dress like you. And then I'll sort of let this slide sit. And in a couple of minutes, they start to look around the room and realize it's a room full of white guys who are all dressed alike, who all the exact same cooler or tumbler or whatever it is. And like, I've even turned this into a game of asking people to photograph how many people in your lobby dress and look alike. The record, not surprisingly, is 16 at a financial company in New York. But the problem is that if we are not aware of this, because the best teams, the highest performing teams, hire for this sort of cognitive diversity. They look for opposing opinions. They look for other people who are, again, are going to be able to push back on them, that it isn't everybody just simply agreeing with the most senior person or the person with the biggest title or whatever that executive is, where we all sort of realign each other to be able to agree with them. That's why a lot of the leadership coaching I do, to be totally blunt, is just teaching people to be quiet, to listen, to trust the people you work with, to be able to do these sort of things. But that ability to recognize that this is important and that we need to actively pursue this. And like I said, this is true from a gender diversity, a racial diversity, a mental diversity. All of these sort of things, again, are things that happen. And I think, you know, part of it for me is also pointing out that any bias can happen with good intent. A lot of it can happen with negative intent, but just the fact that it exists and the recognition becomes very important. But another one, especially as it comes to creativity and knowing that our brain wants to go to try to find a solution to things, is observation selection bias. And this obviously is a big one in any sort of research that gets done. And what that means is that if you have an idea, a hypothesis, if you have an insight, something that you think could be a breakthrough, you will then disproportionately see the frequency of that in research, in data, even in the world, is going to start happening a lot more often. The example that I'll often use is if you are ever thinking about buying a car, or again, like for me, if you're based in New York City, like maybe it's a pair of headphones, like something like this. And you start to narrow in on, well, maybe there's a manufacturer, maybe there's a model, maybe there's a color that I really like. And I start to have this in my head. Well, isn't it magical how then all of a sudden you start to see the frequency of this thing start to happen everywhere? Well, the reality is there are no more cars on the road than there were before. It's just your brain is starting to disproportionately notice these things and start to push you in a particular direction. So it's more than anything, it's just sort of the awareness of how this can influence research, how it can influence creativity, how it can influence outcomes, and that in many cases, the ability to even start to do pre-mortems as you go into doing research and work, because especially for me in the design field, we are just starting to catch up that something in the medical and the research field has long understood is ethics. I mean, again, it is difficult to be able to watch a company like Snapchat that, again, it's fun, it's great image manipulation, but the #1 plastic surgery in California right now is to treat something called Snapchat dysmorphia, which means people are so unhappy with their own image, the way they are in real life, they want to go get plastic surgery to match the way they see themselves in their app. That is an ethical problem that has been created by design where we just want to blow it off for like, oh, well, it's fun and it's moving apps. There's real consequences. But I think that ability to have these sort of things and say, look, where can we go wrong before we start is obviously important. But another big part of it for me is every company, so no matter who it is you work, I know this is the thing, right? Like every company is dysfunctional. I hate to break it to you. Every company in the world, like I've done work where like I've taken people into Apple or Google or Nike and they sort of get all crestfallen that they have issues just like everybody else. And it's not, I don't know what, full of golden tickets and Oompa Loompas or something. But It's that sort of thing of like, there are these sort of cultural barriers that exist in every company that often are systemically responsible for why we're not doing better work. Now, what those are can vary greatly. These are just going to be a few of the most common ones that I see. But it is, how do we come together to acknowledge that we have probably built some organizational debt, some emotional debt, something like that, that may be influencing the way that we do things, and that how do we start to have a conversation about what that is, because there are things that we may see in front of us all the time, but again, we don't necessarily know how to deal with them. So the first one for me that, again, builds up in a lot of companies is something I'll just simply describe as cultural apathy. Now, what that means is that for every company I've ever worked with, there is a phrase that exists inside of that company. So we'll say that this was whenever I was working at Citibank. Well, what it would be is that we would be sitting in a meeting. We would be talking about something we wanted to do. There's a fork in the road where we can lean in and try to be able to take a harder path. We can try to do something that might be different. We can try to do something that, again, is going to be more work. Or we can just sort of give in and say, well, look, it's going to be a lot of work and there may be an easier way to be able to do things. So let's just do the easier path. Well, whenever that easier path is decided, that is normally marked by a moment where somebody in the meeting will, much like this little emoticon, sort of shrug their shoulders and throw their hands up in the air and say, well, look, it's going to be hard, or I'm not sure we can do it, but hey, welcome to Citi. Somehow, like it's this, I don't know what, get out of jail free card. Like if somebody said those words, and it's fine to be mediocre in everything you do after that. And so for me, it was seeing like systemically, how often were we letting ourselves out? And again, as I travel around the world, it's sort of a fun game I play of like guessing what it's going to be. Usually it's either welcome to whatever the company name is, or it's the company name's way of doing things, right? Like those are the two most popular, but there's always some sort of phrase. But I think that for me, it's coming back with a framework. And for me, I think in terms of research terms, I try to reinterpret a framework a little bit differently than what other people might do. Because for me, I think sometimes leadership and change is about very obvious things. Sometimes it's about doing a little bit differently so people buy in. But one of the things I do with a lot of companies is sort of create what I'll describe as like an apathy swear jar. And what that means is that historically, if you would say whatever that phrase is, welcome to wherever it is, you would owe me 20 bucks, and 20 bucks went in the jar, right? And the 20 bucks went in the jar because I wasn't making car payments, like, right, like this was for buying beer or doing something for the team. But I needed to make people aware of how often were we doing it? How often was that mindset winning? How often were we taking that easier road? And you know, at least for me, when you work with designers, like if it's $1, nobody cares, right? Like they'll give you $1 and totally forget about it. 20 was memorable, but I also know that for at least a lot of people in that profession, they tend to be, we'll say, fluid in the way that they tend to budget. So I didn't want it to be so much like they didn't eat dinner. But I needed to create these memorable moments and this awareness to how often was this apathetic culture coming in. And I think by the time I left Citi, we had 35 or 40 of these jars running around the company because people started to systemically see how big of a problem this was. And like I said, there are different ways of being able to do it. There are different ways of being able to sort of point it out. But most of the time, this is something I find in almost every company. Now, I think there's also, I don't know what, at least for me personally, there are certain words that I kind of have a crusade against. Light bulbs is one of them. I recently gave a talk where it's sort of the icon for the entire talk was a light bulb. I tend to have a real war against those because I think that it tries to indicate that doing something creative is easy. Like somehow we just wait around for this moment when the clouds part and arrange champagne and puppies and you get all the answers, and that is not the way it works at all. And so for me, sort of advertising that what it is we do as a profession is easy is not something I'm in for. Failure is another one where I think, you know, a lot of the times, you know, I don't know what, Facebook has produced more sayings that more people like to glom onto. They had one that everybody loved. It's like, I feel like I can't go into any startup without seeing a move fast and break things poster. If you actually work with Facebook, you'll discover that shortly after they put up the move fast and break things poster, about 2 weeks later, they put another one on top of it that said, sorry, slow down and fix your shit. Because I just think that there's certain parts of this where mentality means a lot and the words we use have meaning. Failure to me is one of those because I think, you know, failure to me is an end state of something that is not the outcome that we want. What we want to be able to do, especially when it comes to creativity, is learn. And so for me, there's a fear of learning in a lot of different companies. And this is my thing, right? Like failure is just badly positioned learning. The heart of creativity means, and again, I can tell you, if you want to launch anything innovative, anything different, you need to go out, you need to try a bunch of things, a bunch of stuff needs to not work, we need to iterate on it, we need to learn from it, and we need to share what that is. The sharing part of it often is the problem. And I think, you know, whenever it comes to that, one of the things that I'll do with a lot of teams, and I did this on mine, was we had this culture where we wanted to celebrate the success and not talk about the process. we sort of fetishize the beginning and the end, right? Like and just as a society, we love the two guys in the garage, and we love whenever it makes a bunch of money, we don't ever talk about what happens in the middle. So I started doing this thing called the belly flop of the week, because culturally I had to make these conversations okay. We had to be able to talk about what is going on and share and be open and get over this sort of like perfection mindset. So the belly flop of the week was whenever I'd get my entire team together, I would give a bottle of champagne to the person who would stand up and admitted that they screwed up the biggest and what they learned from it. Because, you know, the ability to try to get rid of that taboo of being perfect and only celebrating the outcome, I wanted to celebrate the process. I wanted to celebrate the learning. I wanted to celebrate what it is we went through, because in many cases we were trying to solve similar problems, but we weren't talking, we weren't sharing. And so we kept making the same mistakes. We were slowing us down collectively. So I think that ability to be able to share that sort of thing and do it in a way where we can change the mindset without just going to everybody and saying, hey, look, share more. What does that mean? How do I connect with it? What do I do? But a lot of it for me is then, obviously there's a lot of work I do is around team mentality. And the thing for me is that in many cases, most of the companies I see will address things in their process and whenever things go wrong, retroactively and reactively. Means we go through, we try a bunch of things, we say what didn't work, and then we do a bunch of process so we don't do it again. Or we go through, we work as a leader, you know, once every 6 months, we look at how did we do as a look back and then try to make changes. So for me, it was just sort of this understanding that we always seem to be looking backwards. And while that was useful, and there's a lot that goes into that is really important, how do we deal with what's going forward? So again, we were obsessing over process, methodology, feedback, 360s, like all of these sort of things. And look, they're important. But that was what I said, right? Like, how are we defining the mentality of the work we're about to do? How do we show up for each other? How do we, again, be able to go through and look at what is that mindset or that social contract that we create for each other? And in many cases for me here, again, it was just getting the teams together to define what I will call behaviors. And behaviors are, in my experience, things like a mission statement or a mantra or values or things like that are great. And they're very aspirational, but almost never can I go to somebody who is working in the field or working on a project and say, look, can you tell me or show me, how does that actually relate to what it is you do every day? And in most cases, they struggle to do what that is. And so what I ask them to do is just, what is the mindset? What are the characteristics? How do we want to show up for each other? And what are the things that we value? Now, obviously, these are going to be vastly different for different organizations. And most of the time, what it is not rocket science. These are not things you're like, wow, I've never thought of that. It's like, no, we think about it all the time, but somehow documenting it and giving it to people is rocket science. Like one of the things we do at my company is whenever you start, you get a little deck of cards, and it's 8 cards. It's all the behaviors. And what happens, especially when you're remote, is that if somebody does something that supports that thing, you can hold it up and call them out for it. But it also empowers every single member of the team to be able to have the difficult conversation about if we are showing up the right way, hold it up, praise them, say that's a really good thing. If it's not happening, it gives you a way to be able to have a conversation about why are we not doing that in a way that is socially acceptable and is empowered. Because without that, the problem is either you accept that we're not doing it the way I think we should, or you sort of have to become difficult and sort of like the group asshole who's going to say like, look, this isn't right. Neither one of those are good outcomes. So it can be simple things, right? So for like a lot of design, or if you do design thinking, that sort of thing, putting your customer at the center of what you do, have them as the source of truth. You need to overcome projection bias issues. It's a simple thing. They're a source of truth. We are no longer going to bicker internally about who is right. That is one of the biggest problems I see for so many companies, is they just endlessly fight over who is right. The problem is at the end of the day, that usually doesn't matter at all. Whatever the customer gets and does it work, that what need to be right. Other ones, like again, inviting as many diverse perspectives as you can to the table. Whenever I was in finance, that meant bringing in regulators and legal and people who I think are just like all the people that we went to art school to get away from. Those are the people you need to bring to the table. But I think that just be able to say, look, this is what we're going to commit to, and to be able to do that consistently. Or again, simple things, like as we look at a lot of collaboration issues, whenever I look at that, it's because teams are throwing processes or presentations just at each other. So again, we're going to say that, look, we're going to have fewer presentations and more conversations because we want to work on collaboration issues. And again, these are very high level. These are things that anybody in the organization can be able to work on. And like I said, you have that ability to put them on simple culture cards. These cost pennies on the dollar to be able to produce. But again, it empowers everybody on the team to be on equal footing and to lean in on this stuff. But a lot of it for me comes down to trust. Because whenever I've worked with, I've spent months and months and months and months working, with very senior teams at Apple, at Google, at all these different places. They're not hiring anybody that's drastically smarter. They're not doing something that's somehow drastically better. They do this crazy thing where they hire insanely smart people and then they trust them to do their job. As crazy as that might sound, that's what it comes down to. But I think for a lot of people, it's understanding why is this important and what is important. Because that's what I said before, especially in this setting, a lot of it comes down to trust. I've seen some insane behaviors out of some companies trying to figure out how to trust their people. But, and again, so we also do a lot of research. And again, I know whenever I can cite the sources and we do a lot of our own research, we've done more research into the impact of creativity on business outcomes than I think anybody else. We've studied 2,200 different companies globally. And as you look at trust, this is not a voodoo sort of metric. That as you look at how much energy somebody brings to work, how much less stressed they are, how much more productive, how much more engagement do they have, how much less likely are they to burn out, to be happier with their own lives, because however much you want, your work life and your home life will intersect at some point. They take fewer sick days, right? Like there's very tangible business results to having teams that trust each other. But a lot of it really comes out in the work. And I think especially now, there is a crisis of trust that is happening. If you look at the wider global economy, there are things that are going on, like something called the gig economy, where there's a very large part of the world that now just jumps from job to job because they no longer trust that companies have their best interests in mind. Again, a lot of different people where trust, and if I'm out of sight, that somehow people feel like I'm not working. Even though a skeptical study will tell you, people when they work remotely are 20% more productive than those who are whenever you can see them, but we're very comforted by the presence, right? So, but there's a lot of these issues around trust that become really fundamental. In understanding this usually is the foundation for most companies' problems or the things that they're struggling with. And it's because there are two types of trust. There is what is called practical trust and emotional trust. And just a sort of a quick high-level explanation of both. So practical trust is just what it sounds like. Whenever I have practical trust in someone, it means that I trust them to do basic things, to show up to work on time, to deliver work whenever it is they say, to be able to be in a meeting, right? Like just very fundamental, very practical sort of things to be able to say, okay, yes, I can rely on that person to do practical things. Well, often, whenever that's what we're investing in, what tends to be the focus is that a lot of it is very process-driven, tools and applications-driven, and the output of that work tends to be foundational, right? Like if that's all that we're gonna do, we're not gonna take any risks, we're not really gonna trust each other beyond just the basics, then in many cases the work is the truth, and the work that is put out from that team is very sort of like foundational. Now, the problem often is that whenever companies or teams, function mostly on practical trust, you get a disproportionate number of people who come to work for a paycheck. They do what they are told because somebody told them to. There is very little passion. There is very little investment. There is very little of sort of the characteristics that you're going to want of an employee as we look at engagement, as we look at passion, as we look at creativity, as we look at leadership, growth, development, turnover rate, a lot of retention rates, a lot of the things like that. Well, I think then there's also this sort of emotional trust side, and that often this is the differentiator, because emotional trust is whenever you believe that the people you work with are on your side. Now, you will actually, if you do this long enough, you will hear teams talk differently. You will hear them start to say that they believe in the mission of the company. They believe in their boss believes in them. They believe that what they are doing is the right work. Like there is a different relationship to the work and to each other. Now, we are very used to seeing and celebrating this in other contexts. If you look at sports, if you look at the military, if you look at musicians, I mean, hell, like even the Avengers, like superheroes, like they're always going to go through and they have some struggle, and whenever they start to trust each other, then there's some billion-dollar blockbuster we all have to go watch, right? But I think that in many cases, we're used to talking about trust and understanding, but whenever it's put into a business context, it suddenly gets a little bit fuzzier. But in many cases, emotional trust is more based in what is the culture, whether that is how do we onboard people, what are the things that we're developing them on, what are the processes, the culture cards, the things like that, leadership and other things like that. But the teams that are able to get to this sort of emotional trust, whenever you look at the products that are put out, that really change something. Whenever you go back and look at the dynamic of this team, this is what you find. Because that's the thing, is that what they are doing is they're coming to work for each other. Again, if you think about athletes, that's the way they show up for each other. Again, I would do work with the military. If you talk to a soldier, they will say that they don't fight for themselves, they fight for the person next to them. And again, high functioning teams need to do this. But here is often, this slide is often the problem, is that most organizations invest and value practical skill sets. You show up on time, you turn in your work whenever you're supposed to, you check a certain number of boxes. Yet they often demand results that need to be based in an emotional trust model. So it's this ability that we're investing in and sort of celebrating one thing, but asking results from something else. And that often this fracture and that ability to understand this is usually the foundation for how you can start to create that change. Now, it's always a big question, right? Of like, how do we start? How do you start to figure this out? How do we go from practical to emotional? That's a much bigger talk, and there's a lot of exercises and frameworks and things like that that I have to work on that. The simple thing that I usually ask people to do is just start with the State of the Union. What is the state of yourself, of your team, of your company? And to do it quite simply is that if you want to do it for yourself, write down the names of the 5 or 10 coworkers you work with the most. If you want to do it as a team, write down the 5 or 10 teams that you work with the most. And then to be able to go through and just sort of do a trust inventory. And the problem is that none is a very viable outcome for how much trust you can have in somebody. There's plenty of people that I have worked with that I don't trust them, that I know at the end of the day, they're going to look out for themselves or do whatever is best for them. And that's a real problem. There are other people you have practical trust in. They're going to show up, do what it is they say. And then there's emotional trust. Now, if you get to any of that are in the emotional trust category, I want you to just sort of recognize you basically sort of get like half points if you have emotional trust, but that was formed because of something outside of work. If you're in a book club, your kids play soccer together, you live in the same neighborhood, like you're in the same Facebook group, like whatever that is, understand that it's great that there's emotional trust, but look at the fact that it had to be formed by something that was outside of work. But for me, this is often an insanely sobering experience for a lot of teams to just really look at, we're being asked to do this stuff, to be able to ask to be aspirational, and yeah, so we want to be able to go do this, but we don't trust each other. So it's like I said, I think these are just some of the basic things that can sort of come into this and is a good starting point. But I just sort of wanted to leave you with a few other just kind of best practices and things to think about. And then obviously we'll flip over to the Q&A and be able to discuss some of this. I mean, look, I think a lot of this is about how do you have a single source of truth for what it is you're doing? Whether you're building an app, you're building a product, you're doing research, like what is the thing that we are going to do that we all agree on is the source of truth? What is the experience? What is that thing? Because a lot of different narratives can spin up about what our customers do, about what data is. Data can be obviously can be interpreted a lot of different ways, but to be able to come together and have very deliberate conversations about what is that single source of truth we're all going to work from. I think other things, like also one of the biggest traps I see in a lot of innovation is that teams will often think or innovate as far as the scope they've been given. You know, one of the most impressive things I ever saw was in doing that work with Apple, and it came out in one of the Samsung trials, so I can talk about it without getting sued into next year, is that if you ever walked into one of the product labs at Apple, what would happen is there would be sort of those big wooden tables, like what you would see whenever you walk into an Apple store. And they have the next 5 generations of every iPhone, of every iPad, of every piece of hardware sitting in there. It doesn't mean that that's whatever it is, the iPhone 16 XL Max super camera, whatever drunk person is in charge of naming their products now. But what it means is like they're thinking about it. That they aren't just simply looking as far as the next phone, the next iteration, the next whatever it is, that they're trying to take a longer view of what's going on. And I think that can be important. That in many cases, and while this can sometimes be difficult, the best cultures are the ones that they are respectful, they are confident, but they are brutally candid in their ways of they work with each other. That they know if they are candid, if they are honest about what is going on, that is the best way they're going to be able to get work done. That's the best way they're going to be able to advance than sort of tiptoeing around each other, having political agendas, doing all that sort of stuff. And again, that's what I can tell you is that it took me a while at a lot of these companies to get to sort of adjust to just how straightforward that can be. But again, it is something that often works extremely well. But also it's like, again, how do we come together to do more of this? To come together as a group, to collaborate, to talk, to be transparent about issues, to be able to talk about this is what it is we want to work on, and to be able to do that, but then have individual accountability. Because it's great to be able to talk about how we need to improve, but there's not something that we're actually going to do and hold each other accountable to it. Then again, this is that interesting talk that we had that didn't go anywhere. And again, I think these are the very hard conversations, candidly, I'm having with a lot of companies right now, that if you want to take on the issues of gender and racial diversity and equity and things like that for people of color, and your way of doing it is sort of having 2 trainings and putting out a PR statement and calling it a day, there's no accountability to that. And so again, I think that ability to say, look, we're going to step up and this is really going to matter, because this is often the problem as you talk about creating change. And I think this is a hard thing to be able to say, but most of the time we don't care about stuff that doesn't affect us. Most men don't care about sexism because it doesn't affect us. Most white people don't care about racism because it doesn't affect us. Most leaders in most companies don't care about what goes on in their own company because it doesn't affect them. And there's sort of a willful deniability that we have with some of these things that causes real issues. And I think, you know, for me, this has been an absolute journey over the last couple months. I've actually stopped my podcast, given it over to different people of color to let them come in to have different perspectives, to learn to listen, to do other things. But it's that accountability piece that's really going to make the difference. Just we're in an accountability and trust moment, right? In time, as a society, as a company, as a people, this is what it's about. And sort of where we go from here is going to be based on a lot of these things. But I think it also is about sort of understanding the role of failure or of imposter syndrome or what that's like, or that's a level of vulnerability, because I think this is what it is for me, is that as we look at what are the new leadership models going to be, who's going to be successful, I think that it comes down to sort of understanding each other, understanding what are our strengths, what are our superpowers, like what are those sort of things. But it really is going to come down for me to sort of 4 key things. And I said this before, right? Like this, I don't think this was necessarily to give you answers, maybe as much as it was to start asking questions. But a lot of the leadership models that I'm looking at, a lot of the leaders that you look at are successful, really come down to embracing 4 things. And I don't know that these are traditionally the 4 things that people talk about. I think 1 is courage. If you want something to be different, if you want something to change, if you want your company to be better, I literally had a talk that I did with a company before this where somebody asked me, how are we going to, like, I want things to be different, but I'm afraid to stand up. I'm afraid to say anything. I'm afraid to do anything. So I just want to stay silent, but I want things to change, right? That's about this, like the CEO who told me they just wanted a proven innovative idea. Like there's some things that these have to go hand in hand. So again, I think that ability to lead with more questions than statements, to say, look, I'm not sure what the answer is here, but can we have a conversation about how to do this, becomes really important. And I think that takes definitely a level of vulnerability. I think that this is going to be one of the lasting legacies of the moment that we are in, is an appreciation of mental health, is an appreciation of other people, is an appreciation that, you know, a lot of us maybe created a mask that we wear to work, that maybe that wasn't necessarily who we are. You know, 70% of the leaders I coach are in therapy because they've spent so much of their career trying to be who they thought everybody wanted them to be that they missed out on who they are. And those coping mechanisms are not sustainable. But again, these are the sort of tolls that it takes on different leadership. And like I said, you're going to have to risk something. Change is not going to happen. Nobody's going to get better if everybody's just like, hey, look, it's somebody else's problem. And so I think, you know, that ability to have that conversation, to be able to risk something and do something differently, obviously plays an important role. And this is what I'd said before. I think that there has to be some accountability. How do we sign up for what it is we want to do? How are we transparent about that? Even if we don't know what the answer is, to say, look, we're going to go on the journey, because that's one of the things about creativity, is that unfulfilled inspiration turns into frustration so quick. Is that ability to say, hey, look, I want to do this. Hey, look, this is really great. Hey, look, I really get my hopes up, and it doesn't go anywhere. Without accountability, you know, aspiration, all that is great, but ultimately it actually becomes sort of a toxic and corrosive environment, because of the fact that, like, we just don't believe that something's going to be different. So that's why I say, I think, you know, look, this is a huge amount of work that I do right now. It's coming in, working with these companies, doing this research, doing this sort of stuff. Hopefully that was somewhat relevant, interesting, important. I think, you know, look, obviously, if anybody on an individual level, a team level, a company level wants to have more conversations about this, dig into more of these sort of things, that's my email address. You can always feel free to reach out to me. To be able to do that. Hi, Megan's husband. To be able to do that sort of stuff. So yeah, I think I just wanted to get her to blush before she had to start talking again. But yeah, I think so. I'll stop sharing there. And I think it'll probably give us about half an hour, 45 minutes, or however long we want to go to be able to just have a conversation about some part or all of this.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Stephen. It's got to be odd not having a clap. I've seen you present in front of very large groups, and usually there's a nice round of applause, and instead we just get emojis that we can put up.
No, I mean, the good news was the podcast was good training, because basically I built an entire following sitting here and talking to myself. So this isn't that holistically different, but yeah. So like I said, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, let's open it up for Q&A. Because of the format, we can allow everyone to unmute themselves. So I'm gonna do that right now, and just let folks pipe in whenever they want. But maybe I'll kick it off with a question I had. You went over so much information, and some things I've heard you speak a little bit more in depth about. But what I would in particular wanted to hear you talk a little bit about is, you talked about a very important issue we have going on right now, which is obviously making sure that we have a very diverse group, and diversity not just of thought, but of the whole gamut. And I want to know really about, especially if you've been ever involved in the process of hiring people or recruiting people into your teams, how do you reconcile that concept of getting the right culture fit with also, getting a more diverse group?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I think part of it for me is I just think culture fit is such a dangerous word, because I think in so many cases, culture fit means, again, you need to look like me, act like me, think like me. I guess that's my sort of thing, is that's what I don't want. Is again, I want people who bring different opinions. I want to be able to sort of celebrate different point of views and all of those sort of things, because I think it's going to make the team stronger. So I think a lot of it for me is to go through, and because with a lot of organizations, where it is they advertise, I think the job descriptions that they write, I mean, I just shredded a company last week because they asked me to look over their job descriptions, and every leadership role said he. It's like, come on, this is 2020. Why are we doing, why is this a thing, right? Like, why are we not more self-aware that we aren't doing that? So again, I think to be able to actually bring in people who are experts on this, to be able to bring in people who are able to look at these sort of things, to be able to make sure that, we are bringing in a diverse slate of candidates. And I think in my hiring practice, it was sort of like, if you follow football, there's a thing called the Rooney Rule, where it's like, look, we're going to bring in X number of diverse candidates on every single role, every single time. This is not up for debate. Because I think in many cases, it was just like, look, if I didn't do that, then I'm just talking to a bunch of white guys. And it's like, look, it's not saying that, again, anybody of any color, any orientation can be just as talented, but I don't want to bias against what that is. And so for me, to be able to create those sort of things, to be able to do that, I think is very important. I think that for me, I can just speak for my journey. I think that for me, there was a time years ago when I realized that whenever it came to gender diversity, racial diversity, and things like that, often what I did was I projected what I thought their experience was like. I never sat down for years. I never sat down with a woman. I never sat down with a person of color. I never sat down with a transgender, and said, look, can you just tell me what's it been like for you? And I think that's why for me, even in the moment that we're in now, that's why I've stopped, because for me at this moment right now, the one voice I don't want to hear from is me. And that's why I've turned my podcast over to prominent, LGBTQ leaders, people of color, things like that. Because I'm like, look, my audience needs to hear from you, not from me. But I think that ability to get those people who are affected, to make them a part of the process, to be able to get them to be able to understand and have them help out and be able to figure out what are the things that they would gravitate towards, and not write alienating job descriptions or write things to be able to do that. Because again, I think that there's so much of that system that definitely becomes problematic. And again, I think there are two women who I work with who counsel me and a lot of others, called Project Inkblot, where I think they'll describe it as cultural defaults, where they can come in and do work and do things like that. But again, I think for me, it's got to be real. And that, that's just like with COVID, nobody gives a shit if you turned your store blue, right? What they care about is what it is you actually did. And then the same thing on a lot of these other issues. And the thing that I think more companies need to realize also is that we are in a moment where everybody is going through this. If you don't want to evolve your stance on racial diversity, if you don't want to evolve your stance on work from home, whatever that is, and other companies do, you will watch your best talent go there. Because again, this is not something where it's like, oh, we had a leadership crisis or we're having an isolated problem. No, everybody's doing this. And so again, I think, just understanding what that is and being able to have those conversations with the people who have been affected, and not, because that was what I said, is that was my biggest issue, was realizing mine was not the opinion that mattered. Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So it looks like some questions are also coming into the chat too. So we'll keep an eye on that too, or if you want to pull in from that. Otherwise, folks can, like I said, sort of unmute themselves and come in. But we'll pull in from the chat right away. Julie writes, it's great to have people to realize they tend to take the path of least resistance through initiatives like the apathy jar, but acknowledgement is probably not enough. In your experience, how can you then encourage people to actually change their behavior and start taking more risk or take a more challenging path?
No, it's a really, really good question. And I think, the advice that I give most people is we go back to that word accountability, is that in many cases, it is super easy for us to let ourselves down. We can say, I want to lose weight. I want to work on something. I want to do, again, I want to be more extrovert. I want to do whatever it is. And then whenever we don't do it, whenever it becomes difficult, whenever there are other things that are more important, it's very easy for us to rationalize why that was fine. Well, the best trick that I've been able to sort of teach people has been have somebody else hold you accountable. Because while it is often fairly easy to let yourself down, it is often extremely hard to let someone else down. So I think if there's a group of your peers, if there are people who you work with, if there is something where you say, look, I'm going to do 1, 2, and 3, and that this is what it is that it means. If you see me whenever I'm not doing that, I want you to call me out on it. If you see that I'm not doing it enough, I want you to call me out on it. If I don't do it X number of times by this sort of thing, I want you to call me out on it. Because then I think that accountability, it's why, again, if you look at other models, why a lot of people will be more successful with fitness or things like that if they have a coach, or a lot of those sort of things. So I think it's that accountability to something that often, because I think, then the problem is also when we let ourselves down, then it turns into a spiral. Because then it's like, well, I did it last time, and am I going to do it this time? And I'm really not very good at this. And, oh, maybe that's just not something I should do, or it's not who I am, or, you sort of spiral all the way down. But I think that ability to, again, to be, extrovert about that problem and have that accountability, that to me has been a really good first step in being able to start that so that you can sort of retrain your muscle memory on how to start to work through things like that.
All right, going down, we have what advice would you give an introvert regarding progressing their careers or remote working, since they tend to have a lower profile anyway?
No, and I think this is another big emerging issue, because I think as we look at diversity, work style diversity is another big part of it, because I think this is something where the advice I have given has evolved drastically, because I think, too many of us have sort of watched that movie where it's like the stand on the desk, thump your chest, alpha, like Braveheart sort of thing to be a leader. I think that in many cases, one is it's how to come together as an organization to understand and value different ways of working, because there are a lot of companies that I've worked with who will classify introverts as difficult, as hard to work with, as, different, and they're not. It's just they work differently. Like, you can't send them a meeting, invite without an agenda. You can't, ask them to be able to respond in the moment. Like, they're just going to work differently, and different doesn't mean wrong. But again, I think that there is how do you as a company come together and say, look, we need to think about and value that there are different ways that people work. And so that, yes, let's have the meeting and talk that through, but then let's also give people a chance to be able to go back and think and be able to come back together at a later time. Don't ever send out a meeting invite that doesn't have an agenda, because most introverts won't show up to the meeting because they're unsure of what it is they're getting into, and that anxiety causes big problems for them. And again, I think this is a whole nother talk that I sort of do, but I think a lot of it is just, again, like anything else, if we want to talk about diversity, that look, by actually saying that we're going to value it, that these are the sort of practices that we're going to implement in all meetings, in the way that we work, to be able to give people different ways of working. Because that's why I said, like, in my experience, introverts often are some of the smartest, most insightful people that I've worked with, but just because they aren't sticking their hand up in the room, because most meetings, in most meetings, 80% of any meeting is dominated by 2 people. And again, but just that ability to say, okay, look, I'm not going to fight with that, but how much thinking are we leaving on the table? So I think that's the thing to me, is that if that's not happening, having a conversation about a meeting, bringing somebody in, doing something to say, look, we need to realize that not everybody's going to work the same. And these are the sort of things that we're going to do to make sure that we really accommodate and are thoughtful about all these different people and how they work.
Great. So this next one's kind of pointed at self-employment, but I think actually applies to a lot of independent workers that we have at the organization, and a lot of people who are working within teams that have independent kind of roles. But how can you foster different points of views and push your creative thoughts when you're sort of an independent?
Yeah, I think that, I think there's a lot of complexity in organizational, there's a lot that goes into it. So there's not going to be a super easy answer. I think for me, there are things like I said, your ability to have a single source of truth, or to be able to go back to, because in many cases, whenever I've worked at so many companies, they don't listen to their customers. And so then it becomes this war of like, who is the biggest title, who screams the loudest. A lot of people who are contractors who tend to be on the fringes get ignored. I think, you know, that way to be able to bring the conversation back to the middle where it's not about opinion, because I think that there's a recognition that, and again, it depends on your culture. If a few too many that I've worked with, contractors are viewed as sort of like second-class citizens, where it's sort of like, great that they're here, but we're going to treat them a little bit differently. I think if that actually happens, then it's about how do we come back with a conversation that represents either through data, through testimonial, through something that is not my opinion versus yours. But I think that a large part of it is also going back to the trust thing of not letting the fact that you are self-employed or a contractor become an excuse. I mean, one of the best pieces of advice I give a lot of people is like, never underestimate the power of lunch. And I know it's a little bit weird whenever you're in this format, but look, just reach out to somebody and say, hey, look, can we just grab a 30-minute virtual coffee? I'd love to hear about what it is you do. Like what's important to you? Like, what are those sort of things where I think if you're able to bring some level of vulnerability to it, and yes, there is a chasm there, but I think if you're able to be the one, and that's why I talked about like risk and courage and accountability, like to be able to do some of those things, to be able to say, okay, look, I just want to be able to, and not everybody's going to take you up on it, but as you start to find the people who are your allies, you start to find the like-minded people, you start to be able to do those sort of things, then, because I think that's the part of it is, right, is whenever it comes down to the ideas that we have, the work that we do, it is not, you know, the organizations that struggle the most are the ones that are defined by hierarchy of title, hierarchy of who has an office, hierarchy of like, you know, again, because most of the time those are organizations where the teams don't get problems to be solved, they get solutions to be vetted. Somebody with a big title or in a lead role said that this is the thing that I think is right. We all scurry around to find a bunch of data that supports what that is. And that, again, we're not actually sort of going into it open and saying that, but I think trying to do that outreach, trying to be able to, you know, base conversations in ways that aren't opinion based, to be able to do those sort of things, I think will often go a really long way to try to be able to build some, because again, that's the foundation of what trust is. I understand the person as a person, not as a title, not as a role, not as an office, not as, they're actually a person. Because again, I think that's who it is I'm going to trust.
Great. The next question actually deals with trust, which is, you know, basically obviously it's very important. What works and what doesn't work for building trust, and what are any special challenges around trust when it comes to diversity?
Yeah, I think, I mean, look, we all have a reference point we can draw on. They're all people who we're friends with. They're people who we trust in our lives. They're people who we don't. Maybe that's friends. Maybe it's family members. Maybe it's things like that, right? I think in many cases, you know, for me, what works with trust is to actually sit down and listen to and care about another person. Because that's the thing, like for a lot of the work that I'll do, I'll sit down with a head of design, a head of engineering, a head of research, a head of product or marketing or executives. And within 2 sentences, I can tell you, they've never talked to each other. They've never spent any time to value what the other person does. Like literally, there's an exercise I do where I sort of take a timeline. And it's like, here's the start of a project, end of a project. And I give every one of these leaders a group of pens, and every color represents a different team. And I'll say, okay, like engineering is blue and design is red. Like I want you to go through for this process and create dots or squares or whatever it is you want about how do you think, you know, all these teams are involved in the process? What's their level of importance? Well, isn't it not the least bit shocking that at the end of the day, whenever I go through that exercise, none of them match? And again, it's because nobody's ever sat down and said, what is it that you do? What is it that you value? Because again, like for me, in a lot of cases with trust, as it comes to a company, what I want to be able to get to is shared goals, right? Like not where this team can blame the other team or like somebody, it's all, because I think that's what you see in a lot of cases is when there's a problem, which is often known as creativity, meaning something didn't go the way we thought it would, what everybody invests in, rather than investing in coming together and investing in each other and saying, look, we're going to work through this. Oftentimes what people invest in is a string of emails figuring out who's to blame. And I think that's a lot of it, right? Is like, if we think about this as a trust economy, doing that erodes the economy. Because if I know that as soon as there's a problem, we're instantly going to go into blame mode, what is my incentive to trust other people? And so again, I think if you look at the actions that you take to be able to say, look, either it's going to increase or decrease trust. And then in many cases, I'll pull people aside and it's like, look, why did you just throw somebody else under the bus? Let's put the shoe on the other foot. If you were doing this work and they acted like you just did, would you trust them? Would you want to work with them? Because I think that's the problem, is like trust is a fragile thing and it can get broken at any time. And so it's something that needs to be vigilantly worked on. But in many cases, I think, you know, that's what will work. is to simply sit down and understand another perspective, and then get that person to understand your perspective, to value both of them and figure out, great, what is the common ground of how we move forward? Because again, if it turns into some game of Risk where like I'm just going to try to annex and take all the, that's what kills me when people like it with business. They're like, oh, well, I need to win. There's no winning in any, like this is not a finite game. There's not an end. This is an infinite game. Either you play and you keep going, or you drop out and it goes on without you, right? Like that is not the mentality that this uses. But I think that ability to say, look, these other people in this way of working matters just as much as mine, is a really good start. And I think that whenever it comes to diversity, I think that's a good start. But look, I think that in a lot of cases, the people who are affected, the people who are the ones who've been marginalized, the people who are the ones that you want more of, those are the people you need to listen to. They need to be put in a position to be able to make decisions, to be empowered, to lead more of those sort of things, because they're going to understand that better than you ever will. And again, I think that's why for me, whenever it comes to a lot of issues around diversity, the one person I don't want to hear from is somebody who looks like me. I don't want to hear from a middle-aged white executive. Because I can't tell you how many painful conversations there have been of somebody who's trying to project whatever it is their issue is. And while I think I can have empathy for it, and I can understand sort of what does white allyship look like in that, I need to be able to work with them. I need to be able to value their opinion. I need to be able to make sure that those are the people who are in positions to be able to make decisions. And because again, if it's just that sort of like tokenization, then we're not getting where it is we need to go. And so again, that's why I said is that's the problem of like the companies that are just like, hey, we did 2 trainings and we made a statement, we're diverse. No, you're not. No, you're not. Right. And I think that's the problem as we look at, the pay gap between, on a gender basis, as we look at the pay gap on a racial basis, like as we look at a lot of those sort of things, it's because, again, if it doesn't affect them, it's not my deal. But again, I think if there is a sincere look, and again, as we talk about that trust economy, a lot of companies, you're starting to see this, and it is freaking out a lot of executives where the people in the companies have started spontaneously sharing their salaries. Like this has happened at a lot of big companies where everybody just says, this is how much I make. If you want to be able to figure out how you're going to level your entire company, wait until everybody starts sharing their salaries and you see just how bad it is. Right. And so, again, I think that ability to either bring transparency, to bring inclusion, to, again, do it in real ways is what's going to make the difference. Because if you pay a lip service, because of that erosion of trust, like people are starting to take radical moves to start to be able to subvert that system.
Great. So I think Megan's got a question. She's going to come on. I just want to also quickly encourage folks that if they did want to chime in, that they can raise their hand, use the raise your hand function, or and that's also a good thing. Go for it, Megan.
So they shouldn't type in after Steve, I have a question, G. Is that what you're saying?
You can do that too. Yeah, that's a great one.
So Stephen, I don't know how often you've worked with academic institutions. I know you've definitely worked with corporations in the sciences, that type of thing, but academia tends to be very rooted in tradition.
Mm-hmm.
How do you balance keeping tradition, but continuing to push the envelope and innovate without people thinking you're going to lose something and doing something a little bit differently?
No, and it's interesting because I think it happens in the corporate world more than you might think. I think like one of the biggest teams that I worked with that was definitely came to light was something like Walmart. Where again, I think, there's a very strong tradition to what Sam Walton did. And again, where people wear their badges is because that's where Sam wore it. Like there's a lot of that sort of thing, right? And I think as you look at either in the academic realm or in the corporate realm, I think that honoring tradition doesn't mean being trapped by it. That I think that there is a way that we can acknowledge what the past has been. There's a way that we can honor what it is that we have come from. There's a way that we can honor what it is of the way things have been done. But it does not mean that in the same way that the school, the society, all the other things that surround it have evolved, that there are ways for being able to do that as well. And that's what I said, is I think that it's just simply an important part of saying, look, these are the things that matter, whether they are the values, whether it's the approach, whether it's the enthusiasm, these are the things that are evergreen for us, right? Like these are always going to be the things that matter. And that those are going to be the things that, again, are sort of not up for debate. Like, again, when you go into Walmart, there are definitely certain things that are not up for debate. Where it is, again, where the company is headquartered, there's a lot that's just like, look, if you want to work with us, there's an entire town that sits next to their corporate headquarters where it's like, you can come build an office here, but we work here and deal with it. It goes very far and wide, right? But again, I think it's then also saying that there are places when we can become confined by it, we can become trapped by it, we can become. And it's why, like whenever I was at Citibank and others, I used to have a huge poster sat in my office that comfort is the enemy of greatness. Because in many cases, you can sort of just become too comfortable. and say, very much like that sort of apathy, well, it's the way we've always done it, right? Tradition, it's tradition. It's the way we've always done it. Okay, again, I'm not trying to sort of throw that out, but I think it's just saying, like, just because that's what it's always been doesn't mean, and that often, that's where, again, you'll see very innovative companies who find some success and they're like, don't change anything. And then all of a sudden their success dies off. There is some part of needing to prune, of needing to refresh, of needing to analyze what it is that is going on a fairly regular basis. Your approach to creativity and these things needs to be a living thing. That does not mean that that living thing flies all over the place and changes all the time, but it does mean that sort of whatever it is can't sort of be like on 2 stone tablets that come down from a mountain, never to be questioned. Because again, you're taking a lot of comfort and a lot of solace in that process, which is fine. But again, you need to understand sort of what is the impact of doing that and what is not happening because of that. So I think that it very much is that balance. And again, there's a lot with, brands like J. Crew or the work I do with LVMH, or like, again, these are long-standing brands that very much value their tradition, but try to figure out how do we modernize that for all the other things that have changed.
Yeah, I don't think J. Crew is doing a great job, by the way, on that. I used to work for them as one of my first jobs. You kind of answered my question. I guess the opposite question was, what is the risk of not evolving as an organization, which I think is important. And I'm just going to ask one other question. When we talk about diversity and diverse teams and diversity of thought, here at Gladstone, we have 2 distinct areas that people like to call science and administration. And when we go to tackle problems, projects, etc., there is not much crosstalk against these 2, yet we all live under one umbrella, which is the Gladstone Institute's organization. How can you encourage us to think differently and get out of those silos and, just build teams a little bit differently so that we can hear everyone's voice and everyone's thought and trust one another's expertise and thoughts to become better?
Well, I think some of it's what I sort of talked about before, because I mean, tribalism is just a natural part of human nature, right? We like to root for our hometown, a sports team. Like there's some collective that we like to organize ourselves into because it gives us a sense of structure and purpose, right? I think that the more you can either look at how are you organized to be able to come together around that, the more that you can recognize that divide is there and the team tries to come together, the more you can try to look at why does that continue to exist? Can there be some more shared goals? Like, again, like it's just more, how do we spend more time figuring out why we're the same and what we can do together than sort of like celebrating why we're different. And I think that just that's the part of it is like, again, if historically that's the way it's always been, okay. Again, you don't want to boil the ocean and change Rome overnight, but if that is, again, one of those pink elephants to be able to say that this is one of the things that we always do, I mean, it feels to me like there's a great company meeting or there's something about like, okay, what are the things that we want to do to try to overcome this? What are the places where it is necessary and important for us to be different for like a lot of reasons? But again, what are the places where we want to invest in coming together and being the same? Because again, I think that's what a lot of teams do is they spend so much time and energy sort of celebrating why they're different and why their way of doing it is right or like whatever it is, that's what becomes all consuming. And that again, we sort of miss out on if that's the victory you want, that's the victory that doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, like it's what goes out the door. That's the truth of what it is. Like, your product is a direct line to your culture. Yeah, like there's so many times like, for me, there are huge indicators of like companies. Like if I look at your website or your app and it matches your org chart, I can tell you how siloed and screwed up you are before we've ever spoken one word. I'm sure there are similar things there where it's like, okay, look, we're not doing things because it makes sense. We're doing things because of an internal structure or logic that only seems to make sense to us. And then again, are those things that are there for a reason? Or again, is it something that again, we want to be able to say, okay, look, maybe there's something we can do different. I see Victoria also has a question.
Thank you so much for the talk. This is really, really awesome. I'm just having such a fun time with it. The question that Meg, I just wanted to follow up on Meg's question, and I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the accountability, which is a topic that you mentioned in your talk. And there are times, particularly now with the DEI being a hot topic for all the organization, and Gladstone is certainly not alone in it. There's times when I express what are the things that we should be doing and what do I think about XYZ, but I feel like I'm expecting too much from my leadership. After all, there's only a finite number of people that can, that really have sort of, they have their own personal bandwidth to really handle all kinds of floods of information and hearing the employees of their thoughts, feedbacks, things like that. So there are times when I feel like I'm putting too much on my leadership. And going back to the accountability, I wonder who really should be, or sort of what are the expectations as far as making these sort of cultural change at an individual level that is not really all about expecting one population in the organization to deal with.
Yeah, but I think what you're describing, though, is I think historically what the problem has been. And again, is that, the people who are being affected, that's a you problem, right? Like, you need to be like, great, raise your voice. But I mean, look, for this moment, again, this is what I've counseled a lot of leaders on. If that is not something that is a priority for you right now, I would love for you to share with your organization what is more important, right? I mean, just honestly. And I think that, this is going to be a moment where a lot of companies are going to do something really stupid of putting a lot of their best talent on the outside of their company because they don't take things seriously. And I think there's a little bit of that, like, look, like, I dare you to not listen to me. Like, if you want me to go work for the competition, like, you can't be that dense. I do not think that it is unreasonable to ask leadership to either be transparent with what their process is, to be transparent with, again, what are the changes that are going to be made. I don't think based on, however long, that week or two they worked on it, they're going to have all the answers, but what is actually being done? Because I think that's the moment of where I sort of referenced before. Everyone is sort of realizing who has got a leader and who's got a manager. The leaders are the ones that are going to step up and say, look, this is what it is we're doing. I think you've seen a lot of really, interesting statements and a lot of really different ways of working out of a lot of companies for a lot of reasons right now, who are being very public about whatever that is on a lot of different issues. And even if they say, look, we don't know what the answer is, this is what we're committing to. And we're going to say it publicly. And that makes it really clear. I think you have a lot of managers who are basically like, how many meetings do I need to get through before this goes away? And I think that historically has been the problem. And in many cases, I think, you have seen that there is an ability to obviously organize as a society or a company to say that is not okay. And either to be able to ask for change or ask for transparency. Again, there's a level of courage and risk that goes into that. I'm certainly well aware, or that there is the ability to then also vote with your feet and say, look, I do not believe that you are actually making this a priority. That's why I said, I think there's about to be a massive talent upheaval because a lot of other companies are starting to work in a lot of other ways. But that's the part of it for me is that, the troubling part of that statement is that if the one person feels like their opinion doesn't matter or that that's not enough, again, I think these are the stereotypes that for me, I really like to try to debunk. I mean, I think that's historically, as you look at the numbers, right? Like part of our problem is that whenever it comes to being a part of a new position or creating change, 90% of men will speak up, 50% of women will do it. Same thing as you look at the way they apply for jobs and for doing different things. A part of that is on leadership to be able to create a culture to break that down. But that's what I'm saying is I feel like, we're at a place where that ability to voice that and to feel like that is being taken seriously and that it is being heard. If that is not happening now, good luck, right? And I think, that's the part of it for me. And I had somebody who sent me an email because for me, this has also been a fascinating journey because for me, as I joined Share the Mic Now, I've turned my podcast over to a lot of people of color and things like that. I've heard from 20 or 30 really lovely white supremacists and hate groups. I've heard from 0 members of the industry. Nobody's joined, right? So, okay, well, there's something there. But I think in many cases that is sort of the issue is like, look, if this isn't the moment, because somebody wrote me an email the other day and they said, aren't you worried about what it's going to do for your career? And what if somebody remembers that you did this? I turned it back around on them and I said, well, aren't you worried that somebody's going to remember you didn't do anything? And so again, I think that it is a moment where if this stuff doesn't matter, that is going to very much set the course of the future of a lot of companies. And that if people feel that way and they do that sort of thing and that's not being taken seriously. So again, I would say in that conversation, I do not think that it is out of line or, again, unexpected to just simply ask for some level of transparency of what is being done. That doesn't mean that you need to totally give in to everything that I want. But I need to understand and see, again, accountability that this is more than talk. So again, I think this is going to be a moment of real reckoning for a lot of companies because a lot of people feel that way. And again, for the companies that are going to evolve, they're going to go work there. But thank you.
I just wanted to follow up on that statement.
What
Oh,
I
sorry,
was going to, I just want to say thank you for asking that, because I know, especially in these forums, those questions are hard to say. And I think, you know, just that level of bravery, again, I hope that there's a lot of people who will support that, who want to be able to ask similar questions, to be able to do those sort of things. Because again, I think the more of that there is, the more likelihood there's going to be change. So sorry,
yeah, Stephen, I'll just, no worries at all. I was just going to say, I think what Victoria is speaking of is a frustration of many in the organization, that failure in this space, a lot of starts and stops and not follow through. And as part of the leadership, I can tell you, as Stephen is experiencing another organization, it's real this time, and it's going to be real. And Victoria and others, we need your help to make sure that it sticks and that it's real, and that the rest of leadership, you know, responds to what they committed or are accountable to what they're committed. But I'm super confident after being here 5.5 years that, as Stephen said, I mean, we're going to double and triple down in this area and make sure that we hold ourselves accountable, but also leadership.
Yeah, and I think, and that's the best part of it for me, right? Is hold them accountable. They say they're going to do something, damn it, make sure they do it. And I think also to be able to say, look, you know, you need our voices in this. If you just say, hey, look, you go figure it out, you're probably not going to get the solution you want because you're probably not represented the way you should in that process. So again, I think, you know, that ability to try to engage with that, to try to do those things. And again, I know sometimes, you know, the history doesn't always help you to believe that that may be the case, but that's why I said, is I think, you know, understand that this moment is different, to be able to do that sort of thing, that, you know, and again, that's why for me, it's like, it's talking about that courage, risk, accountability. Again, I think these are the things that are going to matter. And that if they hold you to it and we're making progress, great. Help them make progress, push them further. If it's lip service, great. Go someplace, because again, then this is not something you should have to be able to just sort of suffer through.
Yeah, and Stephen, I think that the other point you brought up is a really interesting one and kind of a new one, which is the work from home situation and how companies and organizations are choosing to respond and show that they care about their employees during this time. I agree with you. This is going to be a differentiator between people stay. I think there's assumption out there that because everyone's working from home, there's no jobs that are open. And it's just not true. And people are watching how other companies are treating their friends, et cetera. And I think there can be a level of frustration in various organizations that I've seen based on how they feel like they're being treated during this time. So I agree with you. Between the DEI situation and work from home, we're in a new world. And as a company, we need to really think hard about these things. And I would say we just need to bring these issues forward.
Yeah, and that's what I said, is I think if you're able to come into these conversations with either more questions than statements or things like that, or again, bring transparency, bring accountability, there's not going to be an easy answer here. I don't think we're going to be able to undo everything in a day. But again, I think that ability to, you know, for leadership to sit down and listen, for other people to be able to sort of engage in what that is. Yeah, that's why I said it's not going to be a simple sort of thing, but you know, there needs to be real change, and that's sort of, you know, again, I think that's why I sort of said a lot of people don't tend to care about what doesn't affect them, because I mean that was been my sort of interesting journey, is like, as a voice in my community, to be able to go out there and say, look, this matters, to be able to say, look, this is something we need to do, we need to change this industry. And that the 30 people you hear from are from white supremacist groups, and the nobody you hear from is your peers, don't know that there's a better way for me to underline sort of what the problem is we're going through here, because everybody was fine sort of retweeting things and being outraged, but when it meant they actually needed to risk something, do something, you know, be accountable to something, the silence has been deafening. And I think that that's, again, where we're going to need to hold those people accountable and remember who did something and who didn't. And, you know, so again, I think, you know, that ability to have that conversation, to be able to have this conversation, to do things like that, and to be able to sort of come together and just say, look, you know, because I think that's a lot about what this has been. It's not always about necessarily having the answer, as it is just about having the space to have the conversation, to be able to get together, to hear somebody else's opinion, to value what that is, to figure out what is the way forward, what do we want to start working on. Like, just some of those things I think can be some of the most powerful moments, as opposed to getting very caught up in like, this is the answer and this is what it is we want to do. So Yeah, I think, look, if you're having those conversations, it's the right step. But, again, I think it's just definitely, that's been a big part of my journey. Again, my podcast is called The Crazy One. I literally have Here's the Crazy Ones tattooed on my right arm as a reminder to me that I stood silent far too long in my own career and my own work. And at the moment that I started to believe my particular brand of crazy, the moment I believe, that's like history doesn't remember well-behaved people, right? Like we remember the people who are different, who stand up, who fight for something. And I think the problem is that a lot of what we do in the work that we do is we're sort of lulled into believing that by doing what everybody else does is the way to success. Those are rarely the people that get promoted. And so again, I think, the people who are willing to be able to stand up, have a voice, have an opinion, those are the ones that I think are the ones who really make a difference. And that, but so often for so many of us, that's why I said before about so many people who get so caught up in trying to be who they think they need to be, they miss who they are. I think a lot of people sort of try to become the person they think they need to be at work that is acceptable for our company, for my role, my gender, my race, my whatever it is. It's not authentic and it's exhausting. And again, I think, there's a reckoning that is sort of going on with that about, again, how do you show up to be more authentic around a lot of that stuff? So, Katie, I see you got a question.
I was wondering, your points about accountability are really like hitting home for me. Like I want to be accountable, but I'm trying to figure out what that looks like when you're hitting barriers in an organization. So could you talk a little bit about what that means? Does it mean to just be accountable to continue fighting? Does it mean to be transparent about what I am able to do and what I'm not able to do? Does it mean,
I think it means all those.
Leaving
right?
the organization? Like, what does it mean to be accountable?
No, it's a good question, right? Because I think, unless you're sort of sitting at the top of that pyramid, you don't sort of hold all the keys to all the doors. I think, look, I think it is exactly what you said. I think that ability to be transparent about what am I doing, to be transparent about what are the conversations I'm having, to be transparent about how are those going. And that, again, that ability to also then make sure that wherever those barriers are feeling that pain, that understand what is at stake, that they understand what is actually going on, and that, them sort of being the blocker is not going to be okay. And that, again, you are going to be going back to the organization and saying, I believe this is an issue, this is what it is I've proposed, this is what is getting blocked, and that there's probably going to be a bunch of people who are now going to be coming to you to want to ask why. And so again, I think, that or your ability to rally other people around that sort of point, because, multiple people or multiple groups tend to be a little bit harder to defeat. But I think, it is trying to say, look, these are the areas where I have direct sort of like span and control, and I can make a change. And this is what it is that I will sign up for. These are the areas where I feel like I have influence. These are the areas that I do not. And I think just simply that level of transparency to be able to do that, to be able to put that work together, to be proactive, to be able to say, look, this is what it is I'm doing, declare it openly, put timelines to it, put accountability to it, put transparency about what's going on with it. Again, I think, that's the thing. Most organizations are more of a Queen Mary than a speedboat, right? Like they don't corner quick. So I think, but that ability to say, look, this is what it is that I'm doing and that this is what I'm going to stand up for. Again, like there are certain leaders I've worked with where they are going above and beyond what their HR standard is for hiring. They're saying, look, my company does not require a diverse slate. I'm doing it on my team anyway. And there's some of those things where it's like, look, I'm going to go above and beyond the minimum to be able to do that. I think all of those sort of things can help. But like I said, I think it also is where you are hitting those barriers or it's not empowered. There need to be those conversations about how do we shift that.
Thanks. That's helpful.
No, good. And like I said, I think, so unfortunately I gotta drop off because I have to go run and do another one of these. But look, as I said, I put out my email address for everybody. I'm more than happy to come back, do another one of these or do something else like that. We'll embarrass Megan horribly. It'll be tons of fun. Do all that sort of stuff.
I got a few ideas cooking, Stephen. I'm definitely going to be in contact. Yep.
Okay. Well, cool. Like I said, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for the great discussion. Like I said, I think that ability to take that forward, I think is good. And that's the other thing I would say is as you see those sort of members who are saying, look, I feel like I'm having that same pain, feels like maybe there's, again, a good way to be able to get together and say, look, if we as a leadership tier are all feeling this sort of thing, might be a good discussion to have about how do you get together and again, figure out how to change that. So thanks so much, everybody.